I've got all the questions written down that I want to ask you, but I'm going to pick out two key things that came up earlier on when I was talking to Robert Fox and Andrei, who is a Ukrainian MP, earlier on. And that is that not the question that this war could go on for perhaps years or even decades, but they all agreed that the next 6 weeks to 3 months was crucial. It could be won or lost in that short a timescale. Do you agree?
That seems a bit optimistic, does it not, considering how little change there has been in the past few weeks, where there has been, in the east of the country, which is where the action is at the moment, has been going a little bit in this direction, a little bit in that direction, no significant breakthrough for either side. And while the rest of Ukraine is pretty much back to some kind of normality. Yeah. So to expect that to change dramatically one way or the other, ideally with a victory for Ukraine, I think is a little bit optimistic. Of course,
if we're in those who believe that Ukraine should fight on for victory remain in the long haul.
I think so. Let's certainly hope so. President Zelensky has said that he wants the war to end by the end of the year, and I think that may even be a little bit too optimistic. But of course, as a politician, he wouldn't say, "Well, let's do this for several years." He has to put some sort of realistic timeline. But it's certainly not weeks. And also we should remember that all of this depends on how much supplies Western friends of Ukraine manage to send in and what type of supplies it is, because it has to be usable by the Ukrainians.
Yeah, absolutely. The other crucial thing about General Sanders talking about the 37 moment, obviously, is the choice between rearmament, resistance and fighting on, or appeasement. Robert Fox, very senior journalist, a man I've known for years and respect greatly, said that the growth in appeasement talk, Matthew Paris has added to it in the Times this morning, is deeply worrying and profoundly dangerous. If the population out there of the United Kingdom are to stay on board with Johnson's strategy of support, do you agree an article here and there can be dangerous?
It can. I wouldn't suggest that everybody reads the commentaries in the Times, but in accumulation, it creates a narrative, I think, where people start saying, well, we've done our bit now. It's maybe there's nothing much.
And to be fair, that kind of talk, almost exactly as you put it, is widely heard in France and in Italy and to a degree Germany.
In Germany as well. There was just the other day, there was another letter, open letter by a bunch of intellectuals who said there's really no point in Ukraine continuing to fight. In fact, one of the signers subsequently said it's pointless. How can it be pointless to fight for your own country? But anyway, if that's the narrative in Western countries, the countries on whom Ukraine depends to supply weaponry, to supply ammunition, and of course to provide diplomatic support, it really is very dangerous.
The final point, and of points that rose from the previous excellent conversations with other friends, Elizabeth, is the suggestion that perhaps Liz Truss, politically, is reading the room a little more astutely, given what you've just said, than Boris. Boris Johnson's crystal clear. He wants to back Zelensky absolutely to the hilt. He says freedom doesn't come cheap. That's what he wants to do. Truss puts in that little caveat, we will back them as much as we can afford to. Maybe she's reading the room as far as British taxpayers are concerned. Does that worry you?
It is worrisome because you can't say we support the freedom of other countries or their right to defend themselves and then not come through for them. That is not a real friendship. And we should also think about if something were to happen to the UK, we here in the UK would want friends to help, not just for the first 3 or 4 months, but until we manage to prevail against the adversary. The UK, of course, has the enormous advantage of being part of NATO, which Ukraine doesn't have. But nevertheless, if you have professed to be a friend of Ukraine, you can't just say after 4 months, well, yeah, it's not convenient anymore.
Sure.
So I think Liz Truss is, however, reading the room.
All right, let's bring another mutual friend in, Christopher Mayer, who we normally introduce as former ambassador to Washington, which of course he was, but in this context, perhaps slightly more importantly, former ambassador to Bonn as well, and a man who knows the politics of Europe intimately. You also worked in Number 10, Christopher. Do you suspect, fear, I don't quite know what the right word is there for this question, but you know where I'm coming from, that Truss may be reading the British electorate, the British taxpayer, slightly more astutely than Boris Johnson on this particular issue?
Well, she's certainly sniffing a wind which is blowing, of which there's no doubt at all. I agree with a great deal what Elizabeth has just said. In fact, I can't think of anything I disagree with in her remarks. But I also have a slightly different take on this war. It's been fought at different levels. There is the military war, which has been fought by the Ukrainians on their own territory, on their sovereign territory. There is the cyber war, which is raging away. And I think the other day, the Russians made a major cyber attack on Norway, which is, of course, a member of NATO. And then there is the economic war. And I think this is the economic war. This is a long-winded way of answering your question, Alistair, but I think it is the economic war that is going to decide what happens next. And the economic war means who is going to crack first under the strain of the economic cost of fighting. Sanctions, we hope, will inhibit Putin from going on with this aggression. But it may not, because the Russian capacity for suffering, as we know, is enormous, and it far exceeds that maybe of most Western European nations. And Putin's calculation is that with the global rise in the cost of energy, with inflation in general, with the global cost of food, with the prospect that if he cuts off gas, which will harm him but will harm the Germans and others even more, it may be that Western electorates will crack before the Russian people turn to Putin and say, oi, this is too much. Yeah. In which case, we will have to draw the political consequences of that, which means negotiation.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll come back to that point. But on the economic war, the newspapers are awash this morning with the talk about Snake Island, which kind of controls the access to those vital trade ports along the southern coast of Ukraine, and widely reported that Russia now is not letting any grain leave Ukraine unless it's going to Russia. That's economic war as well, that can hit the price of bread, it can hit what we buy, the flour that we eat, because Ukraine's one of the greatest bread baskets of the world. That's economic war too.
It is economic war too, and I think the interesting thing is the Russian ban on Ukrainian grain exports is hitting very hard countries around the world whom you would expect Putin wants as allies. But we've recently had the Senegalese president go and meet Putin because of the damage it's doing to the grain export ban is doing to African countries. But what we don't realize, I think, here in the United Kingdom is that Putin's propaganda has managed to shift the blame in these countries to not away from Russia and onto NATO for supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. So we are taking the blame in all kinds of countries around the world for the suffering of people in the Middle East, and as I say, in Africa. And that is an added pressure on us when it should be an added pressure on Putin.
All right, I'm going to bring Elizabeth back in to go 2 steps back into something you said earlier on. You're an expert in cyber war. Christopher mentioned it with the attack that's going on there. I heard a very, very senior military figure at a dinner just a few days back saying, I mean, in effect, to translate it crudely, you ain't seen nothing yet as far as Russia's concerned. Tanks on the ground, rifles being fired, sure. But they do retain one of the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world, and they are very, very adept at the cyber war that Christopher just referred to. I mean, that's a real worry, not just for Ukraine, but for the world.
For the world, and we should remember that lots of people around the world are trying to help Ukraine in this cyber war. through the Ukraine IT army, which is a lovely outfit. But the risk of lots of volunteers around the world joining this outfit is that they then conduct this. It's not just if it is happening. They conduct cyber attacks against Russia while sitting at home in London or in Glasgow or in New York or wherever it may be, on behalf of Ukraine, even though they don't operate under any sort of Ukrainian command and control system, and they can hit Russian targets. And there is a very real likelihood, a very real chance of Russia then hitting back against our countries in retaliation, even though our governments have no responsibility for this army either. And then on the issue of Russia blocking Ukrainian exports, it's a very clever form of economic warfare, because Russia takes some of the grain has stolen from Ukraine and sends it to friendly countries around the world. Others get nothing, and that will cause hunger in those countries. Well, where do you think the people in those countries will go? They will need to go to countries where they can feed themselves, meaning Europe. So there is an immigration crisis waiting to happen if this continues.
Every which way. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I'm going to start this final chunk with you, Christopher, if I may, and then bring Elizabeth in. And it's, as it were, what you both are very eloquent in discussing, and it's the geopolitics of it. I said to Robert Fox back at the top of the first hour that if you look at Ukraine's determination to join the EU and being given candidate status, Sweden and Finland particularly keen to get into NATO, NATO keen to have them on board, whatever mutterings you may have from Turkey. If you were sitting in the Kremlin, God forbid, Christopher Mayer, advising Putin, you'd say, you've got to get tougher, you've got to get nasty, you've got to put... these guys are out to get you. There is a logic to that.
Yeah, there is a logic to that, because, I mean, if you look at the 2 draft treaties that Putin sent firstly to Washington at the beginning of the year and also to Brussels NATO, I mean, not Brussels EU, and looked at the demands that he put in there, one of his main concerns expressed in these documents was the enlargement of NATO. He's now conducted an aggression against Ukraine, which has done the very thing which he says he doesn't like, namely strengthening the cohesion of NATO and bringing in 2 extra members who have stayed out for donkey's years, as you say, namely Sweden and Finland. And we have just had a NATO summit in Madrid, which has completely reversed the strategic concept which NATO adopted in 2010, where Russia was barely mentioned, where the notion of a war in Europe was barely mentioned. Now we have a strategic concept for NATO. It's an impressive document. Let's see where the members put their money where their mouths are, which identifies Russia as the main threat. Now, if I was Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, I would say to Putin, if I dared to, this is a diplomatic and geopolitical catastrophe. You, President Putin, said in 2005 that the greatest geographical catastrophe was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now one has to say, here comes another geopolitical catastrophe, not far removed from that of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which we have created the very thing that we said we wanted to remove. So I don't know how Putin punches his way out of this bag, but I tell you one thing I'm sure he wants, Alistair, is to have a direct negotiation, not just with Ukraine, over the war, over the terms of ending the war.
All right, Christopher.
He wants to sit across a table with the American president.
All right, Christopher, we have to park it there with you, but I'm grateful as always. Thank you for your time, and best to both of you. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much indeed. So the final word goes to you, and it kind of let's conclude with where you started when I put that 6 weeks, 3 months concept to you. Christopher Mayer's final point there echoed the idea that we're in for the long haul unless we can get round a table. Most of you in conversation have said this is not a time to be talking appeasement and negotiation, although many people do say it is inevitable. I am left with the feeling, having spoken to now 5 of you with different views and opinions, that I'm as worried, if not more worried, than I was when I came to work this morning.
You should be. I hope it doesn't go like that every day when you come into work. But with this war, certainly. And another point about Putin is that he, like everybody else, had to spend time alone or with less interaction during COVID. Lots of people struggled with mental health as a result, and I think probably he did too, because the less you interact with other people, the more likely you are to become a little bit paranoid about whether they like you.
I only interrupt to say, but Robert Fox observed earlier on that he doesn't think the talk of ill health is founded. This guy's got crystal clarity of vision, as Christopher Mayer was implying there at the very end of his contribution. He knows what he wants to do, and he'll damn well do it.
Exactly, but he still has a paranoid mindset that is based on the wrong assumption or erroneous assumption that other countries are out to get him. And I think that mindset was exacerbated by COVID when he couldn't interact regularly with leaders. And that makes it so important for leaders to have those conversations, Western leaders to have those conversations with Putin, even though he is a despicable man and he has invaded another country. But if you have conversations with him, at least you have a chance of understanding his mindset and as a result, make policy on the basis of that.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.